Legislation to rename a U.S. highway that runs through two Siouxland states is on its way to President Joe Biden's desk. Monday, the U.S. House passed the bill to rename U.S. Highway 20 the National Medal of Honor Highway in Nebraska, Iowa, and 10 other states. Now, this is the map of 12 states that have already individually designated Highway 20 as a Medal of Honor highway. Now, all of the states from Oregon to Massachusetts are excited for the next steps to honor Medal of Honor recipients on a national level. KTV's Community Impact reporter Taylor Deckert joins us live tonight in studio with more about this accomplishment and why many consider a Siouxland man the father of the movement to rename the Nebraska highway. Taylor, tell us all about it.
Yes, Gene Twyford of Laurel, Nebraska was an active member of the Laurel Veterans Post and the American Legion for nearly 50 years, even serving as the Nebraska state commander of the American Legion in the early 2000s. He was one of the murder victims of the quadruple homicide in 2022 in Laurel. He was instrumental in getting Highway 20 across the state of Nebraska renamed the Medal of Honor Highway.
Gene Twyford, he's called the father of our Nebraska Medal of Honor Highway. This was his original goal.
Gene Twyford is one of the men who pushed to name Highway 20 Nebraska's Medal of Honor Highway. Twyford was murdered in 2022 at his home in Laurel, Nebraska.
He wasn't here to see that we hit the bell or we grabbed the brass ring, if you will. And he won't be here when we do the dedication of the highway.
Daryl Harrison of the Nebraska Medal of Honor Foundation is excited to see the hard work pay off from all parties who put forth the effort. This federal highway spans more than 3,000 miles, covering 12 states, including Iowa and Nebraska. In early 2008, veterans from Oregon began a push to name Highway 20 from Oregon to Massachusetts the National Medal of Honor Highway.
Driving force amongst the 12 states, knowing that we were losing these Medal of Honor recipients as we worked to try to get it done.
The Medal of Honor is our nation's highest award for valor presented to veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces. Back in January of 2020, then Governor Pete Ricketts signed the paperwork officially renaming Highway 20 here behind me as the Nebraska Medal of Honor Highway. In May 2021, the Nebraska Medal of Honor Foundation held a walk across Highway 20 to pay tribute to Nebraska's 74 Medal of Honor recipients. Harrison says he's ecstatic to see the nation honoring the country's greatest heroes.
Hey, you're right in the middle, Siouxland. What's going to be a good thing?
Now, the country waits for the president to sign this bill into law. Harrison says this is the first national highway to be named in the last 70 years. We'll continue to follow the progress on the official naming. Jessica.
All right, Taylor, what a great story. Thanks for joining us tonight in studio for breaking that down.